A polyglot is someone who is fluent in 4 or more languages, and I became one at just 13 years old with this exact method I'm going to teach you in this video. My name is Hamid, I'm 16 and fluent in 4 languages, and I became a polyglot after getting conversationally fluent in Spanish at 13 with just 120 hours of studying. And now I help obsessed Spanish learners like yourself get conversationally fluent in Spanish with my simple methods. Here's my quick before and after.
Podré para mejorar mi español cuando no tengo mucho tiempo libre para estudiar español. Quiero aprender español. Pues para mí me gusta jugar el aeroclip para aprender español, así que ya lo sé la palabra del aeroclip.
And there you saw some results from other people. So these are the 4 things we're going to go through in this video. We're going to talk about first how I became a polyglot at 13, the fluency equation, so the actual method for which I use for all 4 languages, how to implement that, and then we're going to end with a free gift for you if you make it to the end, okay? So let's start. So my journey to becoming a polyglot was actually really, simple and actually kind of easy, and especially compared to the average person, okay? So let me give you some context. I was born in Sweden. I was born and raised in Sweden, okay? But my parents originally came from Azerbaijan, which is a country right next to Turkey and like Iran. It's like between Asia and Europe. As you can see on the map here, it's actually right there. It's like between Asia and Europe, okay? And that's the flag. Obviously, growing up, my first language that I learned was technically Azerbaijani, okay? This is because my parents spoke Azerbaijani with us when we were kids, okay? So naturally, I learned Azerbaijani. I didn't know how to read or write, but I was still fluent. And this is going to go into exactly what we're going to talk about with the fluency equation. So that was my first language, technically, okay? We're going to go in order, and then I'm going to explain which language I'm the strongest in, okay? So the first one was Azerbaijani. Then, for some reason, my parents put me and my siblings into an international preschool, basically. And in Sweden, preschool is mandatory. Obviously, everyone goes to preschool. And so the preschool I went to was like an international one where they spoke English, basically. The teachers were all like from America, or one of them was something from Africa, but they spoke English. So everyone was sort of English speaking. No one actually really spoke Swedish except for the kids there, okay? And the kids there obviously also spoke English with each other because they were like half American. Sweden, if you didn't know, has a lot of immigrants. And so my parents being one of them, there are certain like schools specifically for immigrants. And a lot of them are specifically for Americans who move here. Even though we weren't American, even though I'm not American at all, but we still went to an international preschool. And so my second language was actually English, but it's not just because of the preschool. The reason why was because for some reason, growing up, me and my siblings and my cousins and everything, we all watched like English content growing up. I have no idea why, but like, what do kids watch? Like Simpsons, okay? I remember we used to watch Simpsons, and Simpsons is obviously an American like TV show thing. Or for example, Family Guy or movies. All the movies we watched, everything was all in English, okay? Every single time we would watch like movies with our parents, my brother just convinced them to watch it in English, and they would have like Swedish or Azerbaijani or Turkish subtitles. And so we would grow up, learning English in that way, okay? It's interesting. A lot of people claim that they're polyglots. They claim that they speak 4 languages fluently, and then they just don't. Like, they actually don't. You ask them to have a conversation and they just freeze, okay? When I say I'm fluent in these 4 languages, I'm actually like fluent in them, okay? I'll prove it to you real quick. Jag är född i Sverige och jag pratar svenska såklart. Men I'm Hamid, men Azerbaycan dili bilirim ama çok geçen bilmiyorum. Çünkü anamla atamla danışmışam Azerbaycan dili ama aslında çok bilirim, danışabilirim ama yani çok yazabilmirəm, bir de her şeyi bilmirəm. English, I literally speak English in these videos, so of course I'm fluent. Y bueno, en español hablo con fluidez. Y bueno, acabo de mostrarte mi transformación, entonces, bueno, hablo español. Anyway, so then my third language is technically Swedish, which is interesting because I grew up learning it, but then I remember there's a point where I wasn't really speaking it. I actually don't know. The thing is, I grew up speaking 3 languages, so I'm very like, I'm torn between which ones I'm actually like, which order. But from what my parents said and all that, I know Azerbaijani was my first language, then it was English, and then Swedish was my third language, technically, okay? And so obviously then growing up, I went to a Swedish school, spoke Swedish with everyone, and so obviously that's how I learned Swedish, okay? And then finally, when I was 13 years old, I got fluent in Spanish after summer of 2022, okay? So I've said this story a lot of times, but basically had this guy in my class who wasn't really a bright student, had gone A in Spanish, and I had a B, and I was kind of jealous because I was a nerd, I had pretty good grades, and so I was like, okay, what is this guy doing? He had been doing Duolingo, and so I was like, okay, I'm going to try Duolingo, and then while I was doing Duolingo, I found other methods to learn, other apps, I tested everything out, And eventually, by the summer of 2022, I made it a goal for myself to reach conversational fluency by the end of it. And, well, that's what I did. And you can see in the before and after, the after was me after I became conversationally fluent. Okay? So that's how I got fluent in those 4 languages. Okay? Now, you might be thinking, wait a second, he only got fluent in one of those languages. The other 3 were given to him. That's true in one sense, but not necessarily, okay? And that's where the fluency equation comes in. And so the fluency equation is what I use for all 4 of my languages, even though I only learned one of those languages in my free time, obviously. Okay. And by the way, when I say these 4 languages, I technically, if I was one of those douchebags who would be like, I speak 8 languages, I could say I speak like 6 languages because Azerbaijani is similar to Turkish. And so I can understand Turkish and I could probably have conversations with people in Turkey. But I'm not going to say I'm fluent in Turkish, even though I'm like, Azerbaijani and Turkish are so similar that I can basically understand Turkish. I'm not going to say I'm fluent in Turkish. So just like, same thing with Norwegian. Swedish and Norwegian are so similar that I could pretty much understand Norwegian and have a conversation with someone from Norway. But I'm not going to say I speak Norwegian because that's just lying, okay? People that say that honestly get on my nerves, okay? When I say I speak these 4 languages, it's because I actually am fluent in these 4 languages because I use them every single day. I speak Azerbaijani and Swedish with my parents. I speak Swedish at school. I study like my material all in Swedish. I speak English in these videos and I think in English. And Spanish is literally the language that I learned, okay? And by the way, in terms of the languages that are strongest, I would say my strongest is English, then Swedish, then Azerbaijani, then Spanish. But even then, Spanish I'm still completely fluent in and I can still hold conversations with natives, right? So just so you know, okay, I just hate it when people online try to brag about their languages and then you ask them to say something and they're literally frozen, okay? I'm not bullshitting you here, okay? Okay, so now let's talk about the fluency equation, which is what I use for all 4 of my languages, okay? So firstly, when I was going fluent in Spanish and finding all these YouTubers who were doing different methods of learning Spanish and all of these different definitions of fluency were getting thrown around, okay? And so eventually I came to my perfect definition, okay? And this is the definition that I hope that this channel is all about, okay? So from the YouTubers I've seen, there is a simple definition that I recognized from all of these YouTubers, okay? That was that fluency is defined as being fluent. That is literally what it says in like the Oxford Dictionary, okay? Now that's kind of vague, right? What is fluent then? Fluent is having fluidity when you speak, having flow, okay? So stream of words coming out of your mouth. That is what fluency means. Now, usually in our society, for some reason, we think that being fluent is defined as being able to speak effortlessly and articulately. But this isn't accurate in relation to what most people want out of fluency. Because the thing that most people want out of fluency isn't necessarily blah blah blahing out words. It's not necessarily about speaking as many words as possible per minute. It's mostly about having conversations. And while speaking fast is a nice thing to be able to do, being able to blurt out a bunch of words is not the same as being able to have conversations. Okay, you can imagine a shy guy, right? Someone who doesn't blurt out a bunch of words and is kind of shy. He's still fluent in the language, but just because he doesn't blurt out a bunch of words like I do in these videos, doesn't mean he's not fluent, right? What we want out of fluency is having conversations and being able to connect with people. That is what like the core of fluency is. And so that's why in my opinion, I'd like to define fluency in 2 categories, conversational and native. Okay, so conversational fluency is when you're able to have a conversation where both parties understand each other to the point where they can have a conversation, okay? If sometimes I don't understand one word that you say, that doesn't mean that we're not having a conversation, right? If you can understand 90% of the words that I say, you can basically have a conversation with me, right? Because let's say you didn't know the word, like a random irrelevant word, like, I don't know, a guard, right? A guard for a clipper. A lot of people here don't know what that is. That's like barber vocabulary, right? Even if I said that, most people could still understand me just because of the fact that we understand most of the things I'm saying. So conversation fluency isn't about perfection. It's about flow or fluidity in the conversation. It's the back and forth. So as long as you can have a back and forth in the language, that means you're fluent, and specifically conversation fluent. That's why I clarify in the videos that I became conversation fluent after the summer of 2022. Even though I wasn't blurting out a bunch of words, I was still able to maintain conversations with natives, and that is the ultimate goal. Now, native fluency is like the secondary goal, where you're indistinguishable from a native, meaning your accent and every other aspect of the language is identical to a native. This takes years. okay? So if you're wondering why I would separate the fluency into two categories, is because if you're watching these videos, you only care about conversational fluency. Because 99% of people, when they say they want to get fluent in Spanish, they don't mean they want to be able to write a novel in Spanish. They don't mean they want to have perfect Spanish either. You don't even have perfect English. How are you going to sit here and say you want perfect Spanish, right? No one is perfect in any language. Now, like, even think about the 5-year-old who speaks English. He's fluent in English, right? But the 5-year-old is still a 5-year-old. Their vocabulary isn't developed. They make a bunch of mistakes in their language. Even in these videos, I notice myself that I make certain mistakes when I speak just because of the sheer volume of the amount of things I have to say. But that's fine because you still understand me. We're still having the conversation. And so most people, when they talk about fluency, they're not talking about perfect language, you're blurting out a bunch of words, you're sounding smart and like all that. No. Most people just mean you want to be able to have a conversation. You want to maintain the conversation about various topics, okay? This means that the goal of fluency is conversational fluency, not native level fluency. And this matters because of what I like to call the effort discrepancy. Discrepancy just means difference, okay? So the effort discrepancy or the effort difference is that between conversational fluency and native level fluency, there is a discrepancy, right? A difference between the amount of time and effort you put in to the amount of results that you get from conversational fluency compared to the amount of time and effort that you put in for native level fluency compared to the results that you get from it. Basically, 90% of the results that you get from Spanish, from learning a language, is from conversational fluency, not from native level fluency. In one hand, you're having conversations with natives, and on the other hand, you're having conversations with natives where they think that you're also a native. It's like that little bonus that they think that you're a native is like 10%. No one, like sure, it's cool, right? It's cool to be able to talk to someone and they think that you're like from Mexico, and then in reality you're not, right? It's cool, but it's like 90% of the reason you learned Spanish wasn't because of that. It was because of having conversations and connecting with people. And so that's why the first goal is conversational fluency. And this matters because comparing the amount of time and effort it takes to reach both of these goals, it is absolutely insane, okay? This took me 5 to 6 months of studying, like 120 hours of studying spread across 5 to 6 months. This is something I'm still working on. Like native level fluency is literally something I haven't even achieved yet, okay? And obviously, I've put in maybe 190 hours of studying into Spanish. So you can tell I haven't studied Spanish much since the 120 hours. But you can see that I still got like all the benefits from Spanish. I was still able to connect with everyone who speaks Spanish, basically. And so putting fluency into a formula or an equation for both conversational and native would be this exact formula, okay? Speaking multiplied by understanding equals fluency. And in this case, we're talking about conversations. We're only talking about the context of conversations, okay? So in a conversation, the reason why this is the formula for fluency, and specifically conversational fluency, is because in a conversation, there are only two skills that are being utilized. If we're having a conversation, you and me, what's happening? It's I'm speaking, and then you're understanding my audible speech, right? And then we switch. You're the one speaking, and I'm trying to understand your audible speech. Meaning the only two skills that an individual needs to have in order to have a conversation in a language is to be able to speak it and understand it. And specifically, when we talk about understanding it, we're talking about understanding the spoken version of the language, right? Not understanding like text, right? Because that's different. In real life, there aren't subtitles below me when I speak. And so when we're talking about understanding, we're talking about understanding audible speech. So those are the only two parts of the language that matters. And so when we want to study, those are the only two parts of the language that we should study. The reason why this matters is because this is actually how I got fluent in all 4 languages. In fact, this is how every single person on earth got fluent. Anytime anyone ever got fluent in any language was through this equation. And I'll prove it to you. My 2 Arabic friends who speak Arabic completely fluently, you can consider them natively fluent, okay? They can't read or write Arabic. Think about that. They're fluent, like they're completely fluent, but they can't read or write it. Why? Because the only 2 skills that they do have is speaking and understanding Arabic. But they can't write it at all. They can't read or write it at all. They can't read it. They can't do anything with it. But somehow they're still fluent. Because the only skills that are required for fluency are speaking and understanding, okay? And what this looked like for me was, growing up, all I did for Azerbaijani was speaking with my parents, having conversations. And so guess what skills that I was using? I was speaking and I was understanding their audible speech. Think about that. And when I learned English, you know how I learned English? I grew up watching shows and I spoke English with my siblings and cousins. Guess what the two skills that are you being utilized in that scenario? If I'm watching content in English, I have to be able to understand it by hearing it, right? So I have to understand the audible speech. And if I'm speaking with my siblings, I have to be able to speak English and also understand them when they speak English. So it's the only those two skills being used. I only learned how to write in English after turning on the subtitles and then actually learning how to write, okay? I didn't learn how to write until I was 6-7 years old in English. Obviously, no one really knows how to write when you're a kid. But yeah, and then let's talk about Swedish. When I was learning Swedish, I grew up in Sweden, so I heard Swedish everywhere. So understanding Swedish, right? I was practicing the skill of understanding audible Swedish. And then obviously I was speaking with people as well. Now I was also reading and writing Swedish. But here's an interesting thing, okay? Here's what I love about this, because the fluency equation proves itself every single day, okay? So Swedish is my third language, technically, okay? Now, I would still say it's my second strongest language. I would say English is first, then it's Swedish, then it's Azerbaijani, then it's Spanish. And Spanish and Azerbaijani can kind of switch a little, because my Azerbaijani is not that great. I actually can't really I can read or write it, but barely. I'm holding on for dear life when I'm reading Azerbaijani. Let me just divert your attention here, okay? So I speak Swedish fluently, of course. And what's interesting is, in Sweden, right, you get grades for Swedish. So there's a class called Swedish, okay? And in that class, I have a B, okay? Which is pretty good, okay? Now, my Swedish friends, I obviously have sort of several Swedish friends because I grew up in Sweden. They have C's. But you know what's interesting? If someone if someone were to evaluate our Swedishes, their Swedish versus my Swedish, and in the sense of fluency, they would say that I'm less fluent than the Swedish guy, obviously, because he's a native Swedish speaker, okay? Technically, I was born and raised in Sweden, but it's technically still my third language. And so even though we're both fluent, most people would say that the Swedish guy with a C in Swedish and I have a B in Swedish, they would say that his Swedish is better than mine in the sense of fluency. And so people would be wondering, okay, then why do I have a B? And this is the reason why. It's because my reading and writing abilities in Swedish are actually pretty good, at least compared to my other Swedish friends who are more fluent but have worse reading and writing abilities, okay? And so think about that. Their speaking and understanding ability when it comes to Swedish is better than mine, or maybe specifically just speaking, because understanding, we both grew up in Sweden, so we both understand basically the same things. But when it comes to at least speaking, the one part of the fluency equation, their speaking ability is better than mine, but somehow I have a better grade. Why? Because grades are not just evaluated by the fluency equation. They're evaluated by also reading and writing and comprehension and all these other aspects, right? But if grading in Sweden was only about fluency, I would have the worst grade. And so fluency is only about these two aspects. It has nothing to do with reading or writing, because my reading or writing abilities are higher than the Swedish guy, which is why I have a better grade than him. But his fluency is better than mine because he's more fluent, because he has implemented the fluency equation more than I have. Okay, even though it's very minuscule, we're both fluent, right? It's noticeable for the Swedish people because obviously they can notice these slight imperfections in speech, okay? And so the same thing applies with Spanish, okay? And this is why when I learned Spanish, my priority was to implement the fluency equation, only focusing on these two aspects of the language, because I knew that those are the only aspects that matters when it comes to fluency. Those are the only aspects that matters when it comes to a conversation, because the only two skills that are being used in a conversation are speaking and understanding audible speech, okay? And so the concept is very simple, right? If you want to get better at crunches, you would probably do more crunches. You want stronger abs, you probably need to train your abs, right? Now, even though you could do squats, because squats do train the abs, right? You still wouldn't do squats to train your abs, right? And so the same thing with reading and writing in Spanish, for example. Reading and writing can help with your speech and your understanding speech, but it's not better than just doing the thing that actually gets you there, which is actually speaking and understanding, right? It's like saying, would you rather practice this motion in the air in order to get better at swimming, or would you go into the water and then practice the motion? You'd go into the water, because what is swimming? Swimming is in water doing this motion. It's not in air. So it's a very simple concept, but a lot of people try to go against logic and facts because they just don't want to do it that way. I don't know why. A lot of people, I got a lot of hate on my Dreaming Spanish videos where I talk about why it's not the best method because it doesn't prioritize the fluency equation. And it's even though I present facts and logic and everything, they still deny it, okay? Hopefully, if you're watching this, you're not denying facts and logic, okay? It's as though it's the equivalent of trying to argue against gravity. It's like, it's just a fact. You can't argue against it. And so the same thing applies here. This fluency equation is just a fact. You can't argue it. Anytime anyone ever got fluent was through this equation, okay? And so anything that isn't a part of the fluency equation will not get you closer to fluency in the long run, right? There's more leverage on speaking, on doing these things, okay? Okay, so now you understand the fluency equation and how I used it for all 4 of my languages, okay? Well, now you're wondering, okay, how did I implement the fluency equation specifically for Spanish? Okay, because I implemented it for all 3 languages that I grew up learning, but that was sort of accidental. How do I deliberately implement the fluency equation? And here's where we talk about the next one, which is what I like to call the learn-sir ladders. So, as we know, we need to implement the fluency equation, okay? So now the question is, how do we improve the skills of speaking and understanding spoken Spanish, right? How do we implement the fluency equation? How do we improve those skills? And the answer to that question is extremely simple. By speaking and understanding spoken Spanish. Again, there's no overcomplication here. You get better at what you do by doing more of it, right? On this channel, I will only present to you like the facts and logic, the very, like, the factual things, okay? There isn't like a specific method that is the way to learn Spanish. It's like, no, there are millions of ways to do it, but it has to implement these. Because it's the same thing as like, if you tried arguing against gravity, it's like, you're not going to win. It's the same thing here. A conversation is literally these 2 skills, and you get better at skills by doing more of those skills. It's like, there's no arguing there. It's just a fact, right? And the way we do that can have different methods, and that's where we go into exactly how I like to implement it. But for you to implement it, this is basically the exact framework. You get better at something by doing more of it. So you want to get better at speaking and understanding spoken Spanish, you need to start speaking and understanding spoken Spanish. And so you get better at speaking and understanding by speaking and understanding. And so what this looks like in a 3-step framework is simply, in order to get better at understanding spoken Spanish, we have to listen to spoken Spanish, of course. Then we want to try to understand that spoken Spanish. And then now that we've understood it, we can go back to listening again. So we repeat. So this is what I like to call LUR, listen, understand, and repeat. And so to get better at speaking Spanish, we need to speak Spanish, of course, and obviously we don't know how to speak Spanish, so then we want to go to the next step, which is to understand how to say something in Spanish. And now that we know how to say something in Spanish, we got to go back and speak Spanish again. So repeat. So sir, speak, understand, and repeat. And so what they look like visually is what I like to call the learn-sir ladders, okay? And this is basically a visual representation of the fluency equation. This is how we implement the fluency equation. So very simple. You can see for LUR, you listen, and then you understand, and then you listen, and you understand, and you listen, understand, and listen, and it's just the repetition, right? The arrows represent the repeat. For getting better at speaking, you want to speak, and then you want to understand how to say something in Spanish. Technically, it starts from understand. You want to know how to say something in Spanish, and then you want to say it. And then you want to know how to say something in Spanish, and then say it, and then repeat. So this means that fluency is at the top of these ladders, okay? And so the more that you climb this ladder, the better your Spanish will get. This is what I did in the summer of 2022 to get fluent. In fact, anytime anyone ever got fluent was through climbing these 2 ladders, okay? Now, sure, there are other ladders to climb, such as the writing ladder or the reading ladder. But again, those don't matter when it comes to fluency. And again, we're talking about conversational fluency. So that is exactly how to implement the fluency equation, okay? There are millions of different ways to do this. Millions of different ways. As long as you find a way that does it the best according to conversations, that is the way. And I talk about the way I like to do it, which I personally believe is the best way to implement this, okay? The best method for getting conversationally fluent in Spanish is the method that climbs these 2 ladders the fastest, okay? For me, those 2 exercises are what I like to call transcript training and narrative contemplate, okay? But for you, it could be something else. That is just what I like to do, okay? Now, I do believe that is the best method, and you can learn about those methods in many other videos. But just for you, just for your sake, for you to implement the fluency equation, that is exactly what it looks like, okay? And that is the exact method that I used to become a polyglot at 13 years old. And here's a picture of it, okay? Here's the fluency equation. Here are the ladders, and at the top is fluency. This is all just a small piece from my program. And so if you want to implement these frameworks and finally get fluent in Spanish in a clear and structured way, then check the description to join my program. But act now, because I don't know when the price may increase. So if you want the cheaper price now, then join now. Otherwise, you can check the description or the pinned comment to grab my free, easy to use Cognate cheat sheet, where you'll instantly unlock thousands of Spanish words, and there's no email needed. You don't need to opt in or anything. You just get it instantly. You click on the link and boom, you got the PDF, okay? And this is just my free gift for you for watching to the end of the video, which I really appreciate. Otherwise, I'd really appreciate it if you shared this video with someone who you think would benefit. And yeah, stay humble.